It's good to be here again. Thank you so much. You always do me so much honor, inviting me to share with you. And you were such a joy to be with. My husband was here last week and he just had a great time. He was so happy and so impressed. And 2 hours one way on a Sunday morning is kind of difficult for him to do a lot. But he says he will, he'll watch the video. Yeah, that. And he will find times and ways to join you. And I'm happy about that. So thank you very much. And I will not be here next week, but my daughter will be coming and she will be talking about visions and dreams. And so I hope you enjoy her. I do. This week, working on the presentation I wanted to make, I sent David a copy of what I wanted to share. And then the other night, I'd gone to bed and I fell asleep. And then I woke up and I said, that's not right. So I sat up and that happens on occasions. I was awake. Every now and again, I'll wake up and not really wake up and write down something that I think is absolutely brilliant. And it's not. So today I wanted to share what is being copied is the more statement of fact stuff about Indians and what's always been called in this country the Indian problem. But I want to talk more personally about my experience. I was a baby boomer, I still am, I guess. And we did not get television until I was 10 years old. And, in our neighborhood, there were oodles of children, just absolutely modeling the fact that our parents were so happy that the war was over. So many kids. And we all loved TV. And we especially loved the Westerns. Lone Ranger and Judge Roy Bean and Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. And I never could understand why they were considered married when she had a different name. But that was 1956. And of course, one of the things that we absolutely loved to do as kids was to play cowboys and Indians. And we'd all gather in somebody's yard and pick who's the cowboy and who's the Indian, and it varied. But the kids who had the cap guns were the ones who were the cowboys. Although, bang, that makes a pretty good gun anyway, doesn't it? Bang. The Indians, and I was frequently an Indian, we made bows and arrows by just cutting a little a stick out of a tree and trying to bend it, use kite string, to make the bow. And then we pick up sticks that were long enough and kind of crooked, but they worked like dandy, bows and arrows. And then we would start, because cowboys and Indians never got along. We always fought. And we'd be out there on our steeds, and I can't bounce the way I used to. But riding our horses. And us Indians, we'd ride the horse, aim our bow and arrow, and go, woo, because that's what we thought Indians were supposed to do. And how we were supposed to do all of that with two hands, I don't know. But, and then there was always the inevitable, bang, bang, I got you, Larry. Nah, You didn't get me, you missed me. And then it's, miss me, now you gotta kiss me. And then it's, Larry, you gotta take your dad. I'm not gonna take my dad. If you don't take your dad, I'm gonna tell your mom. So Larry would fall down and roll over and moan and groan, and his trusty steed would be standing sadly by his side. We spent hours doing that, racing all over the neighborhood. And we lived on the other side of the tracks, okay? We lived in a new post-war housing development over on the other side of what's now 71 that hadn't been built yet. Well, most of our education about cowboys and Indians came from TV and the movies. And, you know, the cowboys never had to take their deads. It was always the Indians in the movies and the shows that took their deads, or the Indians who had to ride off into the sunset and go somewhere else. Well, our education about Indians wasn't much better when it came to the schools. They didn't teach us a whole lot about Indians. We did learn that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Correct. And he landed, and everybody thinks it's wonderful, even though he sort of missed his destination by like half a continent. But as far as we ever learned, was that he was greeted happily by the pleasant Indians, and they all got along, and then Columbus sailed back home again. Took years to learn what the real story on that one was. We learned from some teachers that the Indians sold Manhattan Island for a handful of trinkets. Wasn't that silly? Wasn't that ridiculous that those Indians would sell all that land for a handful of trinkets? They just had no idea the value of land. That's what we learned in school. Mostly our Indian education was in the month of November, just before Thanksgiving. And then we would have our little reenactments of the first Thanksgiving. And I was always chosen to be the squaw. Please, never use that term, please. It is vulgar and demeaning and disgusting. And it was used by white people to be vulgar and demeaning and disgusting. But in those days, I was the squaw. I was chosen because I had long black hair and almond-shaped eyes, and nobody really knew, including me, that I was an Indian or what that meant. That I would carry the ears of corn in and lay it on the table, and that was always my role. Well, once we got to high school, we didn't learn a whole lot more about Indians, except that there weren't any Indians in Ohio, not anymore. They had all left Ohio about 100 years before. We didn't even know what tribes there would be in Ohio. And we kind of got the impression that they just kind of packed up and left and wandered off, happily. And it wasn't until I was an adult doing some research that I discovered that the Wyandots, who were kicked out in the 1880s, were so upset that they would climb trees and the soldiers would come along and try to pull them out of the trees, and they held on for dear life because they did not want to leave their homeland. Sounds like us. So, they did teach us about wickiups and teepees, and I can't tell you how many times people have asked me, do you live in a teepee? No, I do not. I live in a house with central air conditioning and heat and indoor plumbing. But I try not to be sarcastic, really. Well, we had no idea in those days, those wonderful days of childhood, that the government, wishing to solve the Indian problem, had been sending buses to reservations out west and having people get on those buses, and then they would take them to cities and drop them off in the middle of the city and wish them luck. What they were trying to do was separate the people from the reservations and their people, and they told them, here's a new way of life for you, go take it. That's how the Native American centers in large cities got started, because here we have people dropped off in a city, most of whom had never even been in the city. They had never had to pay rent or utilities or water, and they were considered to be dirty and ignorant and not a good job source, so they got only the most minimal jobs, part-time or as whatever kinds of dirty things needed to be done, and that's what they were left with. So the Indian centers were begun as a way of helping out and keeping people connected as much as possible to their culture, their people. We have an Indian center here in Columbus. It's located on Innis. They've moved since I've left Columbus, but they work with the people. But I was a typical teenager. I was at that cusp between bobby socks and stockings, busy with school, church, and girlfriends, boys, and homework, and daydreaming about the future, and I didn't really give much thought to who I was. Only to the burning questions of, am I wearing the right thing? Am I ready for the geometry test? Is Joe going to invite me to the prom? And I was part of a rather restrictive conservative church in which it was considered that dancing led to pregnancy. And I'm here to tell you, I have 4 children, and my husband and I never once danced together. So, something wrong with that one, huh? But the fact that I didn't know who I was as I was growing up was because I didn't know my father. And my mother, who was a rather whimsical person, had always told me, I had this teeny tiny birthmark right here. She always said, one drop of Negro blood and you're a Negro. This was the 40s and the 50s. And this is your one drop, she said. Your father was a Negro. Why my mother said that, as I said, she was whimsical, but I thought, all right, okay. And I think maybe it was a good thing that she did tell me that, because I didn't have any really preconceived notions there. But nonetheless, Not knowing my father, not knowing who I was, I always felt like something was missing. But as things go, I went to college, I got married, had some kids, and then a wonderful day, miraculous day, I met my father. And one of the very first things he said to me was, "We are Cherokee Indians, and we are proud of it." 10 words that changed my life. Because I could never really explain, didn't feel a need to explain long black hair, it ain't black anymore, the almond eyes, the shovel teeth. I could never explain why, no matter what I was involved in, I felt like I was dancing to a different drum. I seemed to have a different consciousness about things. So from that day on, I've been on the red road. And what an exciting journey this has been, filled with pain and sorrow and love and joy. The story of my people has to be told. It's not simply a story, it is a long, dangerous, magnificent narrative of beautiful and amazing people. It is the narrative that for all these centuries, in spite of all efforts to extinguish us, our people have survived. Our people wept, but they also sang, we danced, we prayed, we survived. One of my earliest tasks in the quest to understand my history is to understand the history of the colonizers and indigenous people from the indigenous perspective. I'd always learned it from the colonizers' perspective. The age of discovery, the age of discovery and the doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of manifest destiny were all designed to permit the conquest by Europeans of inhabited lands and to force their religion upon the inhabitants or kill them, whichever came first. And then the task was, for me, was to learn about the relationship between the fledgling US government and the people, to learn of the treaties, all of which were abrogated by the colonizers, and the lengths to which the settlers and the government would go to remove the first inhabitants from their land, our land. They had many strategies. Germs were one of them. It was one thing to pass your germs to people who did not have any kind of natural defenses for these strange new germs, measles, typhus, influenza. But it was quite another to infuse blankets with smallpox, that virus, and then to give them to the people. Whole villages were wiped out by these diseases. Many, many of our people died. We grieved, but still we sang, and we danced, and we prayed, and we survived. And warfare, that was a little harder, especially after the Indians got the same kind of weaponry that the white people had. Our warriors knew the terrain, and they knew how to sneak around better. But they kept coming, and they kept coming, and they kept coming, and eventually they defeated us. And even then, as we were burying our dead, we still sang. We danced, we prayed, we survived. And then, of course, there was the forced removal of the people. I don't like to wear t-shirts when I'm talking to people, but take a look at this in the Trail of Tears. It seems that the settlers wanted land, needed land, and they were insatiable. They had to have more and more land. And so what the government did in order to appease the settlers was to move the Indians out. And I told you before the story of the Cherokee, some of whom hid in the mountains, in the caves in the mountains, and then were able to go back into southern North Carolina. Others, thousands of others, were removed west. And then there's this huge crowd of people, my people among them, who sneaked away from the homelands and started north, in a way much like the runaway slaves did. The government, sent the people across the Mississippi because that wasn't part of the US lands at the time. And nobody seemed to want to live there until they did. And then the people were moved on again. But let me tell you a personal story about the Trail of Tears that we had here. My friends, my people, my relatives in our little tribe in West Portsmouth called Callagee Fire. We had been granted the use of a couple of acres on the land where the bird mound was located. And we took really good care of the bird mound and of the land there. But there was some trouble that was caused by other Indian people. And I know that we had a meeting with the county commissioners hoping to retain use of this land. We had a little building on it that we used. We had our sacred circle, and we even had a council house. And, all of these things do not go into the ground. They are surface level because there are some burials around the mound. And we were very, very careful about that. So when we had the meeting with the commissioners, I had done some research and I put together a little booklet with all the laws on why this land, this 2 acres, cannot be built upon, because it was against the law at that point to disturb Indian graves. And there were several other laws also. And they handed it to their attorney and said, "Is this true?" And he said, "Yeah." But they kicked us off anyway. And the day that we had to announce it to our people was a sad day. And we began to leave the circle. And as we left, the men began to take down the circle and to remove the fire in ashes. And another woman in the tribe, she and I just grabbed a hold of each other and we sobbed all the way back to the house. And that was the day everyone gathered in the house because that was going to be moved to. And we cried. And the women waited. And I can't do it without getting a sore throat, but they cried. and we cried. And that was the beginning of the end for our little tribe, Talladega Fire. So we did experience in a small way that removal process. Now, I don't know how many of us were left to sing, to dance, to pray. And aside for a couple of young men, I'm the only one left. The others have, as we say, walked on. Well, during the whole removal process, Indians were supposed to be the vanishing race. And in order to kind of keep some records, there's a guy, maybe you've heard of him, Edward Curtis, who had a wagon full of Indian clothes, and he rode all around the West, and he had people wear costumes, and he took pictures of them. And it was not necessarily the fact that they were dressed appropriately for their tribe, but there are all of these pictures now, very famous, in all sorts of collections in museums and stuff. But during this time of history, the eugenics movement gained momentum. And the leaders of the eugenics movement went to great pains to protect the purity of the white race. They began to classify specifically various people. And this effort in classification is called pigmentocracy. And I personally believe that with the proper misuse of DNA, we will soon have a classification system of genetocracy. Well, the state of Virginia was especially virulent in its crusade for unblemished whiteness. It was led by the Register of Vital Statistics, Walter Plecker. He was diligent at rooting out even a hint of non-white blood. And, you know, at that time, there were many anti-miscegenation laws, and there was a particularly draconian one in Virginia. You may have heard of the movie or the book, Loving versus the State of Virginia. This was the story of a white man who married a black woman, and they spent a year in jail, and they finally took it to court, and they won. And it was not until 1969 that Virginia's anti-miscegenation law was rescinded. Now, if my husband and I had gotten married in Virginia, we married in 1968, we would have gone to jail because he was marrying an Indian woman. And Mr. Plecker had my family name on his list somewhere. And I suppose, and I really need to talk about this, one of the most horrific, almost unsurvivable actions by the federal government was taken from the 1930s to the 1970s. The US government, under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, began to sterilize Indian women. Most of the women were not informed that they were doing this. Statistics suggest that in the early 1970s, more than 42% of Indian women of childbearing age were sterilized. These would have been the women out west on the reservations. This resulted in the near extinction of many of the smaller tribes. By 1976, approximately 70,000 women had been forcibly sterilized. And it's only in the last few years that this information has been uncovered. We survived, but oh, the tears and the grief and the pain that was shed. And our songs were sad songs, and our dances were slow dances. But we survived. But we also have the thing that's called paper genocide, when the government simply erases your story, your history, your person from its websites, its history books, its pictures in government buildings. That's happening now, you know. And it's called paper genocide. And we're working extremely hard to try to maintain what we need in terms of our papers. Many people have lost their legal rights as Indians or Black or others, because there's so many others whose paper is being destroyed. And you know, in West Virginia, now my father's family ended up in West Virginia for a couple of generations. There were bounties placed on Indian people. And if you were caught being Indian in West Virginia, they could take your children, take your land, your property, and send you away. And so our people did the best they could to hide. There were some friendly registrars and doctors who knew that you were Indian, but would not register you that way on birth certificates. And on one hand, that was a very kind thing to do to protect you and your identity. But then in 2008, when our grandson was born, he was born just over the border in West Virginia. My son tried to get him registered as an Indian, and they refused to do it. So this paper genocide, much of what we have to do to prove our identity, we don't have any access to because it's not there. And then we can't talk about what has happened to our people if we don't talk about the Indian boarding schools. Probably the greatest scandal in both the United States and Canada, because children were taken forcibly from their parents. And they were taken to these schools, their hair was cut. And you have to understand how important hair is to Indian people. Their clothes were removed from them and they were given white people's clothes. And if they inadvertently talked in their own language, they were beaten. And one of the worst things about this is that many of those children died. And many of those children were just placed in mass graves. And most of those children's parents were never informed. And it's only been in the last 10 years or so that this has become public, really public. I once went with some people, a group I was a part of, to Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. And I think it's just the height of cynicism, really, because that same campus is also the U.S. War College. And, you know, for many, many years, Indians were under the Department of War before they came up with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the saddest thing about Carlisle School was to see the graveyard whose children had been buried. And they're one of the last to be returned to their families because the US Army has been quibbling over protocols. So that's one issue yet to be resolved.
They could also tell when they dug up the bones of that many of them had been starved.
Yes. Yes. Things are so hard to talk about, aren't they? All of these events taken together have led to deep suffering and generational trauma. At this time, now we lose too many of our people, our relatives, to overdoses and criminal activity. And much of this trauma stems from the legacy of broken promises, stolen children, forced removal from our lands, our cultures, our religion, our way of life. This is not just a health crisis for us, it is a spiritual crisis. And we are struggling to return to our roots. Our songs, our prayers, our languages, our families, these things which were targeted by the government to defeat us, we are returning to them. We have not been defeated. And our people still sing, and we still dance, and we still pray, and we still survive. We learned long ago how to survive. We taught our children and their children in the wintertime, in the privacy of our own homes. We have taught them. We taught them how to live, how to sing, how to pray, and yes, how to weep. And we know now, as we have always known, that no election, no party, no outside government will be the thing that saves us. We are our own salvation. We are our own warriors. We are our own leaders. We are the seed that fell between the cracks on the concrete, and yet somehow we continue to grow. This is truth, my friends, my relatives, because in our thinking, we're all relatives, and what happens to one of us happens to all of us. As long as the rivers remember, we remember. As long as the stars sing, we sing. As long as there is one voice speaking our name in the dawn, we are not defeated. We survive. We sing. We dance. We pray.
It's a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow.
Any questions?
I just want to say, when I was in Canada and Quebec and everything, they now call the Indians the First Nation. And I think that is so honorable. I just felt that was a nice way. I was impressed. I wish we would do that.
It's a nice acknowledgement.
Yeah, it is. It's just a very powerful insight. Yes.
Under President Biden, I thought he had made the head of the department into an Indian woman.
Yeah, definitely.
Did that make any kind of a difference?
It did for a spirit. And yeah, it did to some extent. And she appointed another Indian whose name escapes me to be the head of the National Park Service. And that was really important because our national parks right now are being threatened. So, yes.
Jean, a number of years ago, I was at an antiques show down in Cincinnati. And as I was browsing through the antiques, I came to a hallway. In that hallway, there was a bookseller. And propped against the wall was this huge book, like this. And it said, Indian Tribes. And I said to the seller, I said, this book should not be in for sale to private citizens. This book should be in an archive.
Right.
So that all the Indians can have access to the names of their people. And he looked at me like I was stupid.
You're crazy.
And like, why not? I can make money on this. And I was so tempted to buy it and send it over to either Allen County Library or at least investigate where it should be going. And I've always wondered about the outcome of that book and others that are like it. Is there a repository of the tribal groups? This had to do something with Ohio and the surroundings.
Oh, Ohio's mess.
I've been reading about that.
Because
It ties into Canada, it ties into Tecumseh.
Because, you know, Ohio isn't supposed to have any Indians.
Right.
We don't have any recognized tribes. We don't have any recognized reservations. And we are not permitted in Ohio, in spite of that, to have much to say in any kind of Indian legislation. And, you know, for years during my far more active years, I can't tell you how many times I testified at how many different government agencies. We're here, we vote, we pay taxes, we up taxes, and yet we have no voice when it comes to our people. And we got a little bit of you know, agreement, a little bit, but you know, every time we begin to make headway with one branch of government or one, you know, administration, then there's election, and we have to start all over again. And you know, I got to the point, it's like there are more of them than there are of me, and I don't know if I can do this anymore. But we have to go to the recognized tribes, and anything that is to be done or saved has to be done or saved by them. So the Cherokee and West North Carolina and the ones in Oklahoma. And then of course, since the advent of Indian gaming, they really got me. You know, don't you dare think you might be one of us, because you might want some of the profits. And so that's been another, you would think, wouldn't you? That we all have shared in the bad stuff, that at the very least we could all join together, but that never was the case, ever. So, you know, we deal with what we got, right?
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story.
Wow.
You shared the pain of your story. It's hard to talk about, it's hard to capture.
It is.
You told us and it's telling so. I went to my other place.
Thank you. Yeah, and it is hard,
Mask.
because I've reached around my house, thank goodness we have a big house. And it was stressing. Yeah, it's very emotional, draining for you.
Yeah.
It wasn't think about it.
So if you don't tell the story, it will die. So we need to hear that. And we need to speak out as part of it with people, otherwise it will fade away. You got to
Yeah, we're watching the same paper genocide.
One of the things, well, Presbyterian women are celebrating, a long history in the church and a long history of doing mission work, and aspiring to that when, nobody had much money, to call their own, and, in the early 1800s. And one of the things that Presbyterian women supported, early things, were schools that were, and they would network, because Presbyterians are we'd rather work with others who are also, doing the same kind of work and bringing the Bible message to,
Heathens.
yes, and in the Rocky Mountain area. So, we're gonna do a play on Wednesday, and I became aware of it because I'm in that play. Not as a character that's talking about that, but I became aware of it because I didn't know whether we should talk about that at the luncheon, because really we should, but the focus here is on intent and not really so much the culture, although the culture is important to be aware of, I think, but the intent of supporting mission by the Presbyterian women, by, to make sure we supported missionaries and the work that they were doing, and our ability to do that, or their ability to do that, when they had very little money and they wanted to support the missionaries they heard about, probably. Early 1800s. So, I don't know, I just wanted to throw that out because it's a Presbyterian connection to these schools that you're just mentioning that were here in the US and in the West in particular.
And Baptist and Catholic.
And Mormon. I was trying to remember the groups that in the play are mentioned as connectional as the other groups also doing this work.
I was at one of the Mormon family history places, and the woman who was working there was saying, "Well, I just don't understand you Indians. We were willing to take your children and educate them, and you evidently didn't want them to be educated." And they said, "And did you want to send your children away?" And she said, "Oh." But I think the mission work was done by people who had a great deal of faith in what they were doing. It was an idea that was a positive thing, but that had the wrong direction to it.
Right.
If I can put it that way. Because in order to accept missionaries, we had to negate our cultures. And that was very bad.
History was whitewashed. That's the thing.
It
You
was.
mentioned the Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Sure. I grew up in Idaho, in Boise, went to school there, and I remember all the handouts that we colored around Thanksgiving, with the Indians and the corn. Sure,
As kids, you don't care, you get the day off. Hey, yeah. This is when I wrote the first part of this book, and I'm sure some people who are here today, but this has some backup for this stuff. It's got some laws and some of the newspaper articles, especially regarding the current president's desire to, he wants the Indians to be picked up out west, to be picked up by ICE and sent away. And he said, maybe no one will notice that they're not Mexican. And there's quote from him in here. And, you know, he's been very unhappy about Indians ever since, was it 93, that he wanted to start a casino. And he was mad that the whatever tribe it was, had, in the east, in Connecticut, had the biggest tribe on the eastern coast. And his thing was, well, they don't look like Indians to me. So, anyway.
They also own the land. They also own the land and he wanted it.
Yes, yeah. So, you know, but these are things I'm telling you, they're going on right now. And they're more public, which is how we know about it, because they've been going on. It's just they're not quite so transparent. And anyway, if you wanna look at this, and I also, I can't read very much of this, but it's called Stringing Rosaries, and it's about the Indian boarding schools. You know, I read it, but I put it away for a while.
Yeah.
And it's fairly new.
Stringing rosaries.
Stringing rosaries. Yeah. So I don't know if you guys do lessons.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.